Good afternoon and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. We're streaming live from the Boathouse here in Confluence Park, and I'd like to welcome you. My name is Jane Scott, and I serve as President and CEO of the Columbus Metropolitan Club. And we do have a small group of folks here in the audience with me today, so thank you all for being here and those of you who are watching online. I'd like to begin our forum by welcoming a new CMC member today. Lauren Lutton from Mount Carmel Health Systems has joined this week. We're happy to have her aboard. And you can learn more about CMC, register for events, join CMC, renew your membership, or make a donation anytime at columbusmetroclub.org. For our upcoming forums, over the past several weeks, as you all know, racism and systematic bias is being acknowledged as never before. In our long-standing tradition, CMC is developing forums that provide community space to explore these issues in our continuing series, Racism, Where Do We Go From Here? We are live streamed thanks to our live stream partners, WSU Public Media, the Columbus Dispatch, WBNS 10 TV, and PNC. We'd also like to thank those of you who have purchased virtual seats for today's forum. We are genuinely grateful for this kind of support, and it's largely because of your ongoing donations that we are able to provide the live streaming, so thank you very much. So for today's forum, The Bias Hidden Within You, we are all prone to act on our beliefs, both conscious and unconscious. What we believe has been formed by many influences: our childhood experiences, our family, our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers, our teachers. Anyone that's around us has shaped our experiences. And for many of us, our experiences are mostly homogenized, and we're not necessarily exposed to a wide diversity of opinions or life experiences unless we seek them out. What we think we know sometimes clouds our vision, so we must also ask, what don't we know, and explore that. So please welcome today the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, LLC, Dr. Gleb Siporsky. Welcome, thank you. Founder of Mosaic Education Network, LLC, Dr. Melissa Crum. Melissa? And our host for today, journalist at Spectrum One, Ori Givens. Thank you, Ori. Stage is all yours, and I'll be back with you after a while to do the questions.
Thank you so much, Jane. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for this very important conversation. I'm very happy to be here with you and our panelists to talk about implicit bias. As a journalist, I think it's something that we are evolving in our understanding about as well in the reporting that we do. So it's a really important topic to discuss today, and I'm happy to share this with you. We want to start out with a little bit of an exercise. I'm going to share a little bit about me. I grew up here in Columbus, Ohio, graduated from the Ohio State University, OH. It's so good to do that in a crowd. We haven't been out in crowds in so long, so I appreciate that. But one thing I didn't realize, because I grew up here pretty much my whole life, when I moved to New York City, we didn't think about sports in the same way in New York City. Yeah, everybody likes the Jets, or they like the Yankees, or things like that. And yeah, they have their college teams, but there was no Buckeye Nation in New York City. And because there was no Buckeye Nation in New York City, there weren't some of those cultural things that we attach with being a Buckeye. And one of those cultural things that we might attach with being a Buckeye is a little leery feeling about that team up north, that state up north. You know, Michigan is a great school. Michigan is a great state, and I think that sometimes because of the way that we're, raised here, sometimes we don't necessarily see beyond that rivalry. But it's really interesting to think about how that can kind of look into what we do. So I'm curious to know, when you think about it, how many people know somebody from Michigan? No Michigan fan? Anyone? All right. Now keep your hands up if you would, consider that Michigan fan for, a job or something like that. I see a lot of people would keep their hands up. Is there anybody that would say, I don't know, I would think about that Michigan fan a little bit, I'd look at their resume a little bit harder. Is there anybody that might do that? Well, there are some reasoning to why we might have some of those thoughts based on something so innocuous as, fandom, and Dr. Siporsky can give a little bit more of an understanding on that.
Yeah, so this is a fascinating question. When I present on this topic to, let's say, gave a presentation in Haraco, which is the SHRM HR chapter here in Columbus, Ohio. I did a presentation at their Diversity Inclusion Conference, the final keynote, in 2018. And I asked this question. There were over 100 diversity inclusion experts in the room who were HR managers, leaders. I asked how many of them would hire a Michigan fan. And of the over 100 people, only 3 raised their hand. Only 3 raised their hand. It's pretty common. It feels very uncomfortable to hire a Michigan fan. I mean, who wants to work with those, people in the red all that time, right? And it feels uncomfortable. And that feeling of discomfort that we feel about Michigan fans, or most of us feel about Michigan fans, no matter what kind of poor choices they make in which team to root for, it doesn't really impact their ability to do a good job. It doesn't impact that, but it feels like it does. We feel uncomfortable toward them. And that is one form of unconscious bias. Also the same thing as implicit bias and conscious bias are referred to in the same way. So this is one form of unconscious bias, implicit bias, where we make somewhat irrational choices. I mean, it's completely random whether you grew up here and went to Ohio State or you grew up in Michigan and went to Michigan, which team you root for, right? It's just because of where you grew up. But we have a strong feeling. We still have a strong attachment to it. And we have a strong attachment to a lot of our tribal sensibilities. So Ohio State versus Michigan, that's tribalism. And there are so many aspects of tribalism in our lives. And racism is, of course, a form of tribalism. We have to understand that, and we can talk about that. But I want to talk us deeper about the basis of this. Our gut reactions, our intuitions, what we feel is right, are actually not wired for the modern environment. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist and behavioral economist and been studying these topics. And what they're wired for is actually the savanna environment. When we lived as small tribes of 15 people to 150 people, in that environment, it was incredibly important for us to be tribal. Because if we weren't sufficiently tribal, we'd be kicked out of our tribe and we'd die. So, we are the descendants of all of those, as you'll notice, who didn't die. And therefore, we are strongly tribal. So we want to look for people who look like us, who think like us, who root for the same teams, have the same values, and we want to oppose those who don't, which was the right thing to do in the savanna environment for our survival. That was the right thing, because opposing tribal members, you needed to be hostile to them, because they're going to take your land and territory. In the modern environment, we still carry these tribal sensibilities into the modern environment. And whether that expresses itself in the political system, in racial expressions, in how we treat those of different religions, all of these things are forms of tribalism. And they speak to this unconscious bias, this discomfort that we have. We feel something is right, and therefore we believe it is right. We feel something is the right course of action, therefore we do it, without taking the time to question and think, hey, maybe I should really hire this Michigan fan. All right, I'll swing this over to Melissa.
So one thing I want us to be thinking about is how the tribes of race was a completely manufactured project, right? And so although it was completely manufactured with no real substance that we could validate, that doesn't make the social construct less impactful. And so what I want us to be thinking about as we're thinking about racism is that it was a constructed groups of tribes, right, for a particular purpose, to orchestrate power in various systems and to sustain that. And so when we think about when race was created, we can point out when, where, and who did it, right? It was during the Enlightenment period, 16th, 17th century. There's a lot of things that happened during the Enlightenment period. One was figuring out how can certain countries within Europe can access resources in other places in the world and justify that. That was the only reason it was created, right? And so we have to be clear that it's only certain folks, like a handful, like Britain, France, whoever, those who had the power and funds to start to kind of take over spaces. And then realize that these stories had to be created for people to believe it was a good idea to encroach on these spaces. And so when we think about, for example, this idea of tribalism in order to survive in certain kinds of ways, we have to be thinking about racism wasn't constructed to survive, it was constructed to orchestrate power, and we have to be really clear about that. So when we're thinking about dismantling racism, we have to start looking at the systems that was built for it to sustain. So where are these systems that allow for these stories to be created and for them to live? And so whether that is in education, whether that is in criminal justice system, whether that is in a host of other things, we can see where stories were created. I like to, when I work with folks, I like to introduce the concept of implicit bias as stories that we tell ourselves and that's been told to us that we've chosen to believe. And those stories can be really long, they can be really short, they can be simplistic, they can be complex, but it really depends on the information that we've been given and to determine whether or not that story is working for us, right? And we think of those stories every time we go to a side of town, when we're introduced to someone who is of a different ethnic group, sexuality, gender than us, right? And then when we read that story, we make choices about what we're gonna do with that interaction based on the power that we have. So if I have a story about, for example, women being incapable in leadership, and I have the power to evaluate this woman, that is going to impact her evaluation, right? Whatever story I have about women. And I have a story about people who come from this particular side of town or this particular country or this particular religion based on my power, even if my power is just whether or not to give them adequate customer service or whether I'm going to create policies that impact their access to different systems within the country. I'm reading from a story. And so one of the things we want to be thinking about is how can I be aware enough and conscious enough to think about, is my story as complex as it needs to be for me to be able to make room to allow someone to show me who they are so I can make the adequate decisions. Also, for us to recognize that there are also systems in place, no matter how nice we are to people, that they still can oppress folks, right? That we have certain stories in regards to race that regardless of how nice we are to people, it's still a system that impacts people directly. So we have to see both, right? What are we doing individually, and then how do we feed into these systems and institutions directly or indirectly?
I'd really like to ask you both kind of dig into some of the things and some of the ways that this really manifests for people. Particularly you talked about education and some of those kind of silos of our society. On an individual level, how can we see that bias manifest? And then on a structural level, how can we see that manifest?
So on an individual level, we can, I would say, first think about how are we thinking about people? And then what is our relative source of power? I like to tell, when I do workshops, I like to tell this story about how I loved Disney movies growing up. And I watched Lion King, Jungle Book, and Aladdin. Me and my brother watched them all the time, and you had to get the VHS. Anybody remember VHS? Yeah, I remember that. We had to get them in the plastic case, not the paper case, right, because we were fancy. And we would watch them all the time. And I also, as a young child, had a deep-seated fear of people with British accents. I didn't know what was gonna happen. They were gonna jump out the bushes. I was scared, I was nervous, what was gonna happen? When doing this work and really thinking about the stories that we carried, that I carried, I realized that this fear came from the movies I watched because the villains in each of those movies have British accents, even if it doesn't make sense. Scar has a British accent in the middle of Serengeti, right? Jafar have a British accent in the middle of what, Saudi Arabia. Shere Khan has a British accent in the middle of India. Now, we could think that maybe Disney was helping us understand how the British imperial system was impacting the world, but that's not really what they were doing. Because also, the protagonists in each of those movies had American accents. Aladdin has an American accent. Mowgli has an American accent. Simba has an American accent. Mowgli, who's being raised literally by British-speaking animals, has an English accent, has an American accent. So what that taught me was that people who don't sound like me mean me harm. and people who sound like me are the heroes. Now, if that story was never critiqued, and I was in a position of power to determine whether or not people with British accents can live where I live, could go to school where my children go to school, if I was going to create curriculum that supported British culture, or if I was going to create policies that impacted whether or not they can enter into my country, whether they have access to health care, we can start seeing how that unchecked story that came at a very young age can have significant amounts of power. So when we start to ask ourselves, how are my decisions particularly adding to a pattern of oppression? What might it look like when I evaluate a direct report to me and I say that they're not a cultural fit? What does that mean exactly? When we talk about someone making us uncomfortable, what is that actually speaking to? If we don't really think about have this self-awareness and recognize that we have some unchecked stories, then we can continue to do harm and support systems of racial oppression and other forms of oppression as well.
So, Melissa talked about storytelling. I'll talk a little bit about data. So, very different approach. I was doing a consulting project for a software company in Seattle. And what they wanted to do was move from a boss-based performance management evaluation to a team-based, where team members evaluated each other. And one of the concerns that was raised as we're doing the project from the people was that the majority of white males might not give minorities, whether female, African American, other minorities, appropriate scores. And that was a concern. So how do you address that sort of concern? That's a real valid concern. That's a real valid issue that happens often. What we did was we decided to take a data-based approach as well as training approach. So we gave training to everyone in the company on how to do appropriate evaluation, including how to address tribalism inside the company. So tribalism inside your performance evaluation. But you know what? There's been a lot of research that diversity trainings don't necessarily work very well if you don't do follow-ups, if you don't do then continuation. And so what we decided to do was not simply that, but also evaluate the kind of scores that minorities got versus the white majority males. And what we found was that the white majority males got, on average, as this team process evaluation went forward, about 15% more in their evaluations than various minorities. And that was a serious issue. That's a serious problem. That is a visceral, right there, example of what's going on. You could see it in the data. Can't argue with data. So what we did was then we had a series of healthy conversations that opened up the room for everyone. I mean, it's obvious, it's right there in the data, that, hey, this unconscious bias, this tribalism, is causing serious problems for the company because you're evaluating people unfairly, clearly. And we had conversations in that's not simply diversity trainings, but based on what's going on in the company. Based on that internal dynamic, we had conversations about, hey, why do you rate someone this way? How do you evaluate someone? Maybe you can consider evaluating people who are different than you higher than it intuitively feels to you. And that has to do with how do you address unconscious bias. You need to understand that all of us have some form of tribalism that's wired. So Melissa talked about stories. We are storytelling machines. When you look at us as human beings, that's who we are. We understand the world through stories. We understand the world through patterns. Stories help us make sense of the world. Otherwise, it would be a complex, confusing mess. So stories is how we understand the world, and these stories influence the way we act, influence the way we evaluate people, influence our judgments in very problematic ways sometimes. When the stories that are there are not actually aligned with the reality of the situation. And in cases of tribalism, they're not. In cases of racism, they're not. In cases of gender, they're not very often, depending, of course, on your story, but they're very often not. So these are very problematic things that we need to understand. We need to look at the data, and we need to look at what's going on an organizational level, on an individual level, team level, and of course, on a society-wide level, because we have a lot of data in our society, and we can get data on organizations. There are some organizations that still don't collect data based on various important demographics, like race, and that's very problematic. So those are the things that we have to do. And so in the company, we had a number of serious, healthy conversations, and we also adjusted the scores of minorities by the average of how much they were lower. And over time, the scores of minorities, as this went forward, went higher and were more aligned with the average scores. So that's the kind of things that you want to think about. Now, a crucial part of this, I want to be very clear, this is very important. You never want to use shame and guilt in diversity trainings or in pointing out, hey, you're being bad because you're evaluating this person unfairly. Because what we're going on with, we're acting on instinct, It's just like eating a delicious, piece of chicken, right? Or eggplant. It's very tasty, and we want to eat perhaps more of it than we should. I mean, think about a box of dozen donuts that's left in the break room. Once you start eating the donuts, it's very hard to stop, right, Ori?
Very true.
It's very hard to stop. Even though you probably shouldn't be having more than one donut. Well, guess what? In the savanna environment, when you came across a source of sugar, you needed to have as much of it as you could in order to survive and thrive. We're the descendants of those who can have, when we came across honey, apples, bananas, have as much of it as we could fit ourselves. And so right now, we still have these problematic impulses to have too much sugar. And the impulse of having too much sugar is just like the impulse to be tribal. We need to understand that. That is the fundamental difference. We feel like we want to eat, and we feel like we want to be tribal. It's just natural, intuitive. So there should never be any shame or guilt. Just like you don't use shaming and guilting, fat shaming does not work. Do not do it. Don't do that. It does not work, and actually, when you look at the research in addressing problems, neither does it in diversity inclusion efforts. So when you do diversity inclusion trainings, you never want to use that. You want to use understanding, you want to use empathy, you want to appeal to people's emotions, and help them see how their emotional drivers might be hampering them from achieving their own goals of fairness, justice, freedom for everyone to have equal opportunity. Those are the things you want to be speaking to, and that's the way you want to reach people.
I think it's important for us to be able to recognize that if we're going to think about adhering to or succumbing to tribalism as something like sugar, right? That makes us want to have more. If we connect that to systems that allow us to be tribal in certain kinds of ways without repercussion or accountability, that's when we start getting isms, right? When we start getting things like racism. When it becomes okay to enforce this tribalism, right? And so I do think it's important. I do not advocate for shame and guilt. Guilt doesn't help anybody, right? It doesn't help anybody. We also recognize that that could be a potential part of your process as you're coming to understand certain types of things, but we have to keep moving on past that. But we also have to recognize if we do feel a certain kind of way because we have, in fact, used our power to maintain a system of oppression, that is a calling in for you to pay attention to that, right? That doesn't necessarily mean the person who's pointing that out to you means that that they're doing something wrong or you should dismiss it or whatever it might be. What I want us to continue to always be thinking about is how are systems and institutions set up for people to be tribal in certain kinds of ways? And also, what tribes are based on an exclusion of others, right? So if we're talking about race as a tribe, what are systems that are set up that allow certain folks to remain in this tribe, right? If a system of rating your folks, as you mentioned, in a company, and no one is paying attention to the ways in which certain people are rated lower with no justification, and it's a very subjective system, we can see how that allows for certain people to be rated lower, right? So how can we find out where is racism allowed to thrive in small and big ways, and not just thinking about the interpersonal, like what you said to me or what I said to you, that's important. We should be thinking about that. But going past that and thinking about what are the larger systems and institutions that are being fed by the choices that we make.
I think in that context, it's really contemporary to look at how we're exploring criminal justice right now, the criminal justice kind of sphere of our society, and how biases have been able to manifest from really the very beginnings of this country and the criminal justice system to now where we are looking to how we can change it. I'm curious, you both have kind of talked about power in relation to these tribes, and you've talked about these tribes kind of being constructed. How have these tribes kind of been constructed or reconstructed or deconstructed in order to maximize power? Is there any insight that you can provide there? I think of how race in this country, the idea of who is white changes and has changed over time. And part of that is to annex power. So can either of you enlighten on kind of that annexation of power to be more inclusive and to gain more power and what that means kind of psychologically?
So if we go back to chattel slavery, for example, we had a number of European indentured servants that were working in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, right? They were working alongside Africans in cotton fields, in tobacco fields, working alongside to pay off their debt and then go into the world, right? They both began to realize the person we need to be focused on is the people who own the plantation, like the elites of this space, right? Because most people in America at that time were just workers. Very few people actually owned plantations and had this type of labor. So that they start to band together to fight against these plantation owners. And as you can imagine, the number of European indentured servants, as well as the millions of Africans that were here, some free, some not, outnumbered the folks who owned the plantations. And so they had to say, okay, there's got to be a way that we got to limit this power. And so at the time, the way that who was elite was Anglo-Saxons, or there was folks who would call themselves Native Americans, meaning their ancestors were folks who founded Jamestown and those types of things. So these were European Americans, or Europeans at the time. So then they started redefining this term of white, where it now included Italians and Scots and Scottish folks and Germans and things. And then they started allowing them to have land. If you look at, the name escapes me, but I think it's the Homestead Act, where after you completed your servitude, you got 40 acres and a donkey if you were of European ancestry after you have completed your service. So that was seen as the original affirmative action. Folks who came over, you got free land, you got things to work it. And so now it's like, well, I'm not really gonna band with the Africans now, because as long as I do my time, I get this land and I can work this out. And if you had land, now you can vote. Right? And so we started, as we shift the term of white, again, we gotta remember this, these race tribes were completely fictitious, right? Or not fictitious, they're completely made up and reconstructed all the time for different access to power. So now these former servants are now loyal to the elites to a degree. And so we start seeing how that shifts. We also have folks of Indian descent, meaning India, like from India, and also of Asian descent, suing the Supreme Court for the status of white, so they can get access to finances, they can get access to a host of things. We also have currently, we have research around, for example, Hispanic or Latinx folks who are considered white presenting, or working with mortgage lenders who will mark white on their applications in 2020 because they are clear that the underwriter will likely approve their mortgage application because it says white on it. So when we start thinking about how this concept of white is shifting is not necessarily because people want to be of European descent, it's because it shows a demonstrated access to certain resources and power. And so when we think about what these tribes, if you will, mean when it comes to access and lack of access and who can access it or not, we can start seeing how it starts to reshape. And then we can ask ourselves, well, why is that? What can happen? What do we need to do differently to ensure that these different tribes don't mean you get a better access to the definition of success than others?
I want you to think about someone Asian, so in your mind. Yeah. Probably a number of you thought of someone like Angry Yang, kind of a mathy, sciencey person, finance whiz, and so on. That's kind of our current story of who Asians tend to be. That's kind of the typical, prototypical image, mental image. And it's fascinating to trace the change of this mental image from the last century, now the beginning of this century, a century ago, 1920s, when Asians were excluded from coming to the United States, and they were seen as a very subservient, kind of, denigrated population. And so we see that there's this dynamic transformation in the story of various minorities as their history changes and their relationship to whites changes. In the time when Asians were mainly brought over here to create railroads and mine and so on, they were the subservient, kind of the blue-collar, people who the whites denigrated. They're lower than us. Then over time, as there's still very many Asians who are working in a whole variety of fields, but the predominant image of Asians has changed, especially with the rise of Japan as a powerful state, and with the immigrants coming to the United States to prestigious universities, start of Silicon Valley, the mental image, the story that we tell ourselves about people from Asia changed. That has become the dominant narrative to such an extent that Asians are right now suing Harvard and a number of other universities for reverse discrimination, for taking less Asians because they don't want, because their current standards would admit too many Asians. So that is the kind of dynamic that happens. And it's the interesting thing, and I absolutely agree with Melissa, is that it all shifts in relation to whites, the dominant majority. So that's the linchpin around which everything goes. And we need to understand that all of these stories of minorities, of races, and of course this is a constructed category, are all turning around whiteness like the sun. So we need to think about that. We need to understand that. How do various stories relate to whiteness? And how accurate are the various stories? Of course, the story of the math whiz is not representative at all of the majority of Asians here in the United States.
I think when, I have a lot of Facebook conversations about race. I'm in, for me, growing up kind of in the 90s and early 2000s, when these conversations didn't happen publicly, they happened kind of more in private. You had a lot of people that wanted to ask these questions. And I think, we're going to be moving to some questions from the audience in just a moment. So if you have your questions, we'd really like to hear from you. But I'd really like to refocus to where do we address this next, both on a personal level and both on a systemic level. We're having these big conversations about reimagining things like criminal justice or education or healthcare with the increasing rate of maternal infant death and maternal death in the African American community. So how do we carry these conversations, these discussions to actions that help to level that playing field for those who are racialized in our society?
Well, I think, so we have this interesting thing with COVID, people not being able to leave the house, and then seeing state-sanctioned violence, like with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. But many of us, this has been happening all along. It's just now that you can't move, you're not so much distracted by other things now. And so what I'm finding is that a lot of people who weren't aware about what state-sanctioned violence is and how it's been happening literally for hundreds of years, right? That they want to do something. I want to do something now. And I have to tell folks, you want to sprint, and this is a marathon. It is a marathon, and many of us have been running for a very long time. We want you to join us, but you're trying to run, and that's not sustainable. It's not sustainable. And so I think you can't really understand what your actions can be until you understand the institutions and systems that have been operating for a while. So I would say start with some books. Don't ask your friend, like, well, tell me more about, well, how does it feel to be, don't do that.
Don't slide in their DM.
Don't slide in their DM, you know. So I would say start reading. So things like Color of Law by Rothstein, looking at how redlining and systems of financing and housing created systems of oppression that still happen today, that feed into things like food deserts, that feed into things like people in poor areas paying more for insurance, like car insurance, things like that, people being able to finance. Reading things like the new Jim Crow and how that shapes into our current penal system and how it disproportionately harms folks. Reading things like Push Out by Monique Morris, who talks about how school disciplinary systems disproportionately impact students of color, and how all of those are shaped by this centered concept of whiteness, power, and what stories get told about whom. And I want us to also be thinking about, when people say whiteness, it's not necessarily like white people. Like, I don't want us to just be thinking about like just white people. What it is this concept of whiteness, as we talk about, that shifts, that people buy into or don't, or that shifts systems. And there are people who are not necessarily identified as of European descent who still buy into a concept of whiteness and white supremacy, right? And when we think about whiteness and white supremacy, I want us to be thinking about always how power is operating. Always thinking about it as how power is moving, not necessarily individual ethnic groups or individual groups, people. And so if we start shifting, similar to what you said, if whiteness is the center, we're moving around it, ask a better question around like whiteness and power and how is it operating here? What does that look like? We can say the same thing about patriarchy. It's not about just like men in general. It's like, how is maleness like shaping the workplace? How is maleness shaping choices that are being made by women's healthcare, other types of things? So we can always be thinking about that. And then when we do that and we get more knowledgeable about what these systems are, we can start to think about, oh, I can insert myself in these ways, because I know what my spheres of influence and power are, and I know what I'm willing to do, but we have to be knowledgeable about what's been operating before now.
So Melissa's speaking my language. I love the idea of reading all of these books. That's, books I've read, books I really enjoy. But when you look at the cognitive neuroscience and the behavioral economics of people, what actually motivates us? We are motivated emotionally. And Melissa and I really resonate with reading books. That motivates us emotionally. That may not motivate quite all of you emotionally. So you've got to find whatever motivates you emotionally. There's a reason the video of George Floyd and other videos have been so powerful. Videos are much more emotionally motivating than books, I'm sorry, for most people. They are much more emotionally motivating than books. They're visually gripping. People feel power. People feel connected with so many of their senses. So you want to think about what is going to be emotionally motivating for you and what is going to be emotionally motivating for other people. When you look at the research and how we make decisions and how we evaluate things, about 80 to 90% of our decision-making and our evaluation and our behaviors comes from our emotions, comes from how we feel, not from how we think. So you want to change the way you feel, not simply the way you think. You use the way you think to change the way you feel. But what you want to do in an underlying pattern is change your motivations, change your emotions, change how you feel about people. That's the critical thing that you want to do. And you can do that through reframing, through thinking about things. But the feelings are the main thing that you need to do to change. So if you're going to be doing a training on diversity and inclusion, if you want to teach others, you want to focus on feelings, their emotions. What do they feel? Why are they perhaps scared of people who look like different from them? What is a problem for them? So address those underlying emotions and address those underlying feelings, alleviate their fears. And again, as Melissa and I talked about, no shame nor guilt, but you want to make sure that you address their underlying emotions, motivate them with their values, whatever motivates them, in order for them to be engaged in the effort to address unconscious bias and address all of these horrifying problems which plague our society. And then you want to teach them the right mental habits. There are a number of mental habits that people can follow. So for example, if you see a person who looks different than you, who's not part of your tribe, you want to intuitively give them much more credit than it feels like they deserve. Because again, intuitively, it will not feel right to you. Intuitively, you will not feel the right way about them if they're not part of your tribe, if they're part of the Michigan tribe. You will not feel good about them intuitively. So you want to change your feelings, and you want to rate them higher than you do. And there's much more information about this in my book, The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships, which I'll be signing for those who want to get a copy after the talk.
I do want a quick follow-up. I want us to recognize that emotions do help to guide to motivate us. What I'm asking you to do is think about, once you have that motivation, what are you going to do? And if you're going to do something, you want that action to be informed. For sure, the George Floyd video motivated a lot of us to start asking better questions about the racial relationships with law enforcement. Do we recognize that there are certain things that are legal and illegal, right? Do we recognize that? Because just because something is legal doesn't mean it's right, right? Holocaust was legal, slavery is legal, like that stuff is legal, like doesn't mean it's right, right? So then we have to start asking ourselves about what laws are we aware of that even though it's legal, doesn't mean it's right. Are we aware of that? Are we aware that law enforcement have certain protections legally that allow murders to happen and then they not be held accountable? We talk about different communities, tribes, racial tribes who might commit crime within their spaces. And be clear, everybody does. But there are special protections for those groups of people who commit crime within those neighborhoods and those spaces. If they get caught, they're gonna be held accountable, right? But we have certain laws and protections for certain groups of people, like law enforcement, when things don't go the way the way they're supposed to, particularly when someone is murdered. So when we have to ask ourselves, if we're going to make an action after we've been motivated emotionally, what are we going to do? And sometimes that emotion makes us want to sprint when we really need to take some time, do the marathon, learn the information, and then start to think about what power do I have to influence change.
I think it's both of those kind of spheres that you really approach. It's kind of like a toolbox. What do you need for this situation? Is it that personal story? Is it the data? Is it a combination of both of them? So let's transition. CMC has a tradition of taking audience questions, and Jane Scott, CMC's president, is curating questions from the live stream audience. So if you're here in our audience, you can ask a question. Please keep your microphone time to that question, and please, we thank you for avoiding any editorial comments. So Jane, what is our first question?
Well, we actually have two that are very similar, so I'm going to read them both together because I think the answers will be together. Allison Barrett asks, do you have examples of how words/labels common in business environments also feed into destructive power dynamics, and how to make a shift to neutral, more equitable? And Michael Daniels has a similar question. It would be interesting to look at what titles are holdovers from enslavement: foreman, master, carpenter, journeyman. Are those vestiges, and do we reinforce our own biases by having those? So sort of a similar label word use question.
I didn't think about it.
I'm going to give an example that comes not explicitly from racism, but it's a really interesting one that's really relevant to the unconscious bias that people experience. So I was working in a company, consulting for a company that does housing management for a variety of housing associations. It's a national company, and they were having a number of issues where the central office, which had accounting, strategy, and so on, had conflicts with regional offices, which were customer service and sales. And they were fighting over how to provide. The customer service and sales wanted to do whatever the customer wanted. They were customer focused, whereas the central office was very policy focused. So when there was a $100,000 per year customer that wanted to change the way something appeared in their accounting statement, and that's the regional office really wanted to do that, the central office was like, no way, Jose, no, we're not doing that. And then they started exchanging messages, and they got more conflictual in email until they started CCing the CEO, and he said that he told me in a private conversation that they acted like psychopaths in email. And that was a really problematic dynamic because of tribalism. There was a strong sense of tribalism among the regional offices who had certain nicknames and labels for themselves. Kind of, we are the customer-facing, or sales, we are the true money of the company. We really make the money. And there were conflicts between the central office, the strategy, the accounting, who were kind of saw themselves as the control, as the focus, maintaining the guard, whatever the company needs. And they had certain labels and nicknames for themselves. And that created a sense of teams. So there was a team in the office, and there was a team in the regional offices, and a team in the central office. And that, we talk about teamwork as a great thing, but that teamwork was bad because it created a lot of conflicts between the central office and the local offices. So this does not have anything to do with racism, but it's a perfect example of how labels and ways we think about people, even within our companies, cause a lot of tension, stresses. And that has to do with the stories that we tell ourselves about who they are, who we are, what is good for the company, what is good for the organization. That happens very often. You'll very often have conflicts versus, the HR versus the legal department, or the sales versus the operations. And all of them have certain labels and stories for themselves and for others, where this teamwork, these tribalism, really hampers the company in the end when they don't realize what's happening. And it becomes especially bad when it's reinforced by external stories. These are just internal company stories, but of course they're often reinforced by external stories that tie to racism, patriarchy, political differences, religious differences that are seriously problematic for our society.
I think it was an interesting kind of point to look at it through that lens of like labels and language, because language is a lot of the ways how these things are manifest, whether it's the words or the labels that we use or the coded language that we use to convey some of these stories. So I think it's, if there's an intentionality on anything, it's an intentionality on that language that we use. I know in television and in IT, we have, a lot of references to like a master and a slave. And that's just how the language was written because of how the technology communicated. And so I think there's a rethinking that needs to happen with all of those types of things. We have a question from the audience.
Yeah. This is a question more about the micro level. So we've heard a lot of talk about tribalism, kind of stories that we tell, labels. And it seems like that divides, and oftentimes is a result of fear or the unknown or those kinds of things. On a micro level, in terms of, if you want to call it decision-making bias or implicit bias, how do you get people to treat people as human beings rather than a stereotype or something to be afraid of?
The first step that I find when I talk to people and train people on this is to help people understand what their own internal biases are. I use the Michigan example for a reason. I use it in Ohio, right? That is a very common bias, Central Ohio. That is a very common bias. And you want to tie it to something that people experience. That's the first step. You want to help people experience this cognitive bias within themselves. That's the first thing you want to do, this unconscious bias, this implicit bias. If you don't do that, if you don't succeed in that, everything else will flow past their ears if they don't realize that that's something that they have in some area. So you want to find an area where that person is in some way biased, and then talk about, hey, what are other areas where there might be cognitive biases, implicit biases going on? What might you have unconscious bias toward? connect that to stories and our broader society, these labels that we use. And you want to have people understand that they are, all of us in some ways are biased. We are wired to be biased. We can't not be biased. It's just not in our nature to not be biased. Just like it's not in our nature to not eat more donuts than we should. The only thing we can do is change our habits. We can feel that we should eat all the donuts if we want to eat all the donuts. But you can choose, perhaps, to not start eating the donuts. Maybe take the sliced fruit instead of the donuts. I'm sorry, Ori. But that's a much more healthy snack to have, right? So, or somehow limit yourself to one donut and don't have that box. So that is, you need to find techniques, strategies that will allow you to have habits, because you can't trust your gut reactions. That's the fundamental. If you take away one thing, you take away that from this panel. You can't trust your gut reactions. We can't trust our intuitions. They will lie to us because of the stories in our heads, because of the brain wiring that we have. And that is something that you need to realize, that you need to create habits, behaviors, mental patterns that will help you address these things. Like I said, a clear and easy one is to, when you see someone who is different than you, who does not belong to your tribe, give them much more credit than you feel that they intuitively deserve. Rate them higher on various employment. We'll talk about hiring, and that's one way. But we evaluate people all the time. When we see someone, we can't not evaluate them. That's an intuitive and natural inherent thing that happens. So you want to be aware that, hey, this is a person that's different, and give them higher, treat them as more of a human being, perhaps, than you feel intuitively that they deserve.
So similarly, one thing we want us to do is connect to what's the bias, right? So I was working with an organization, and a woman, an older white woman was talking about how she doesn't believe that she is racist because she had a black female caretaker, and how her family adored this woman. And so I began to, so first you recognize that there seems to be a bias in there, right? And so I then I say the next step is to ask something that makes them challenge that belief. So I say, well, did you ever go to her house? Did you ever meet her family? Like, were you ever peers at any point, right? And the answer was no, because she was an employee, right? So she's supposed to care for you. She's supposed to be liked so she can keep her job, right? So then also asking, I asked her something that challenged this bias. I said, what if I told you that this woman was like an amazing mathematician? Like she was like a physicist when you didn't see her. Does that feel weird? It's like, yeah, I don't think she was capable of that. Why don't you think she's capable of that? What is it about her that makes you think she's incapable? And so then when we start asking questions, we can start getting to why do you think that's impossible, and what's making that connection? And then lastly, similar to having new habits, the question that I would ask them to be aware that you have this story that you didn't realize was there, that the woman that you said you love so much is incapable of being a math genius, right? She could very well be, just didn't have access to spaces to demonstrate that. And then have these habits of what I would call imagined empathy. So I think of it like, you ever had road rage and you're driving down and then you're like, why are these people moving through the road? Like, they're crazy, what's going on? And then you're like, ah, maybe that's just me, maybe it's not you guys. So then instead you say in your mind, well, maybe they have a child that's locked out and they're scared. Or maybe they have a family member that they need to hurry up and get to. And so then you start to calm down, and then you start to feel like, okay, let me just move out the lane so they can get to where they need to get to. In the same way, when we become aware that we're feeling something feels uncomfortable, and we know we don't have any justification for it, what new story can we tell ourselves as a habit? Because we're only telling it to ourselves, right? So how can we retell a story that offers a stronger sense of humanity of that person? And if we continue to do that, that starts to dissipate into the other groups that this person represents. So whether that's race or something else, but realize that if that story that we're telling is grounded, for example, in race, and we start to add more humanity, do that imagined empathy, we can start seeing how that translates in other ways we shape our stories for different people.
Well, thank you so much. I heard some phrases that will stick with me. Racism is a form of tribalism. That tells it all, doesn't it? It really explains a lot. And unconscious bias, we feel something, it feels right, so we just do it, whether it's right or not. So thank you so much for, we, as Dr. Sikorski mentioned, out in the lobby, for those of you who are here, he does have his book here, and we'll sign them, and you're welcome to buy one today. We hope that you'll all tune in next Wednesday at noon, online or here in person at the Boathouse with us as we continue the series, Racism, Where Do We Go From Here? Next week, we'll be exploring justice reform at the intersection of racism and human rights, so you won't want to miss that one. Thank you to our live stream partners, WSU Public Media, the Columbus Dispatch, PNC, and WBNS, and all of our online virtual seat patrons. And thank you especially to our speakers, Dr. Gleb Sikorski, Dr. Melissa Crum, and Ori Givens from Spectrum. We hope that all of you will be back with us next week, and in the meantime, stay safe. Thanks, great job. Stay put, we'll take a picture.